Okay, now we're going to talk about the situation in the Americas, in America, before 1492. And yeah, it's 1492. All right. All right. Paleo-Indians came from Asia during the Ice Ages. If you get into this at all, you'll find that there are some other people talking about possibly Europeans coming from over some complicated thing from Europe to America. The so-called Solutreans, if you read about that, that's pretty much out of fashion now because we've been able to do genetic studies on some very early skeletons, okay? The reason that that was popular, one of the reasons that was popular is the very early Paleo-Indians that came to America didn't look like the modern Indians. They looked physically different. But now we've been able to do genetic studies and we know genetically they're identical. So they've changed their look over time, but they aren't from some other place, all right? So they came during the Ice Age. They were stuck in Alaska many of them were stuck in Alaska to about 9,000 BCE. Actually, now we know that some came down the coast. They found some out in the Channel Islands. And during the Ice Age, the Channel Islands weren't islands, but they were island. There was one big island that was a couple of miles, I think it was 5 miles off the coast. So they know that they came down by boat. And we have a site in Chile called Monteverde that's been dated now. There was real controversies over the dating earlier on, but now they pretty much settled on it being 15,000 BCE. So we know that the first coming of Native Americans was down the coast. But in Alaska, they were stuck the glaciers kept them stuck there for several years, okay? And it's this pause out in Alaska that caused the genetic changes in genetic markers between the Asian population and the Native American population. There are certain distinctive genetic differences, all right? All right, and around 9,000 BC, there was an explosion of something called Clovis. Sometimes it's called Folsom, but it's Clovis, because they found the first of these sites in Clovis, New Mexico. Okay? And they were found all over North America. Now, as humans and animals came to America, animals went away from America at the same time. All right? So horses and camels are originally American, and they migrated to the Old World. The camels left remnants, so the llama, the vicuna, in South America, those are all cameloid species, right? But the horses didn't. The horses were killed off. And as humans moved in, there were extinctions of animals. Now, some people say, well, the climate changed, and some people say it's humans. I tend to think it might be more humans than anything else, because if you look at the modern world, when we think of where animals are, wild animals in large numbers, we typically think of Africa, which is also where humans are from. And that may seem like, well, how did they not kill off the animals there? Because the animals learned about us. They knew how dangerous we were. So you have like elephants. Elephants used to be, I think they are again, daytime plains-dwelling animals. When we were at full force before we got, culturally sensitive about killing off all the animals, elephants were nighttime jungle feeders. They hid, okay? If you look at, so that's why there's still animals in Africa, because African animals know that humans are dangerous things and they steer clear of them. But you go to someplace new like America, the animals, they don't know any better. They look at us, we're slow, we look delicious. And they have no idea we're carrying spears and bows and arrows that can kill them, okay? Anyway, more than enough. So humans settled Americas within 1,000 years. It sounds like a lot, but think about it. They walked from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego in only 1,000 years. That's quick, okay? And by 3000 BCE, they had maize agriculture in Mexico. Now, if we look at how agriculture happened, the first agricultural thing is about 9,000 BCE in the Middle East. They domesticate wheat. But the domestication of wheat is really simple. We know exactly what happened. Wheat's a wild grass, And wild wheat, when the grass dries out, the seed blows away. Okay? But every once in a while there's a genetic mutation in the wheat and the seed doesn't blow away. It stays attached to the stem. Okay? Very minor thing because typically that dies out, right? The grass that blows away, the wheat that blows away, that's the wheat that dominates in the wild world. But that wheat that sticks, that's exactly what we like. So when the percentage of wheat switches from mostly wheat that blows away to wheat that's stuck, that's domestication of wheat. Bingo, we know exactly when it happened. Maize, there are moves in the domestication of maize, we still don't know how they did it. You think about your average cob of corn. The cobs of corn they found, the oldest ones, are smaller than this part of my finger. Okay? This is an amazing feat by Mexican agriculturalists. All right? So here we can see the land bridge and the way they came down, probably initially offshore, and then you can see if you notice it's like gray and white. There's a part that opens east of the Rocky Mountains after about 12,000 BCE, and that allows people to spread into the main part of North America. Okay. These are the famous Clovis points, obviously bigger than life size. Life size are about like this. They have a curve here and a half. There's a part that's carved out here so that you could take the point and stick it on a spear end like that and then wrap it up. So this bottom part would have a split stick coming up and then it would be wrapped. All right? The first wave of migrations to America from Asia came from 13 to 11,000 BCE. Maybe we could probably extend that now to 15 to 11,000 BCE. The second wave comes around 3,000 BCE. They are the ancestors of the Navajo, the Apache, and certain other speakers. Most Native Americans speak in one branch of the family. This branch is called Athabascan, and it's much rarer, and it's only these few isolated people. The third wave are the Alouette and Inuit, which came around 3000 BCE. We know them as Eskimos. Eskimo is really kind of an insulting word. I think I mentioned it elsewhere. I probably shouldn't do that, but I do. Okay. Okay, American cultures. Americans, meaning Native Americans, produced maize, that's corn, peppers, chili, beans, pumpkins, squash, tomatoes, avocados, chocolate, potatoes, and cassava in South America. Potatoes and cassava in South America. I remember looking at this list once in a Sunday supplement when I was a kid, all the stuff that came from America that we eat, and I thought, man, what did they eat in Europe? Must not have tasted good, you know. Agriculture spread out of Mexico north where possible. Remember, if you go north out of Mexico, you change geographic areas. If we were reading Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond makes the point. It's very easy to spread things east and west because the day length is the same time and the climates are similar. So if you have something that'll grow in California, it'll probably grow in Carolina, but it may not grow in Washington or Acapulco, because climates are very different going north or south, but east and west, not so much. So it was difficult for agriculture to spread north and south. In Mexico, large cities developed and empires. In other areas to the north, people developed different answers to the way they live. Okay. Native American cultural areas. In the far north, in the Arctic and subarctic, we have small hunting bands of the Inuit and the Cree. Okay. On the northwest coast, we have an area of very dense populations, but they don't do agriculture. They do salmon fishing, and they do totem poles. You all probably have heard of totem poles, and they do potlatches. This is something that's interesting. So a potlatch is a way to get you get high status by giving things away. If you follow this, think of Oprah's My Favorite Thing show. We all think Oprah's great. What does she do on her Favorite Thing show? She gives a bunch of stuff away. That's what they did in this culture to to become famous. In California, you also had high density. They were small groups. They were not large political organizations. They gathered acorns and they fished abalone. Abalone is a special kind of shellfish. It's like half a clam, okay? Very high protein diet. In the Great Basin, which is like Nevada, Utah, those areas, it was very dry. They just sort of scraped a living. The people that live there are the Shoshone and the Utes. Utes for Utah. Okay. Oops. Mesoamerican cultures. In central Mexico, you had several complex civilizations. Around 1200 BCE, you had the Olmecs, who had pyramids. They had a religion involving human sacrifice. They had the famous ball game with the thing on the side that you can't hit with your hands, but you can hit with various other parts of your body. They had a calendar, and they had writing. So everything that we think of as Aztec or Mayan existed in an earlier form among the Olmecs. They live around the area of Veracruz, if you're familiar with Mexico. The Maya followed the Olmecs from 100 to 900 CE. And notice we're saying BCE and CE. This is because if I asked you what BC stood for, you'd say before Christ. That's really not culturally sensitive. And AD was Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. So now we say before the Common Era and Common Era. The changeover is exactly the same, we just are more culturally sensitive now. All right. Central Mexico, there was, after the Olmecs, there was Teotihuacan, a very interesting city. It had huge influence on large areas all the way down to like Honduras and Guatemala. What's interesting about it, there are no fortifications around Teotihuacan. So apparently they lived in peace. We don't know very much about it. Finally, 900 to 1,000, the Toltecs, who were very militaristic. And this is an Olmec head. If a person was standing here, he'd be about this tall. Excuse me. Anyway, we'll just keep going on. Now, we have one of the parts of this is the Aztec myth of origin. In the Aztec myth of origin, they were migrating out of the north. They were barbaric people, supposedly. They didn't have the culture of the other people in central Mexico. And they were looking for a place where they would find an eagle clutching a snake on a cactus. And I always ask my classes, where do you see this? And inevitably somebody can tell us it's on the Mexican flag. And where did they find it? They found this Aztec, this eagle clutching a snake on a cactus on an island in Lake Texcoco. And they built their capital. Okay? Turned out to be brilliant. All right? The capital was called Tenochtitlan. And by 1500, it may have been the largest city on earth. Okay? Today we call it Mexico City. Actually, the Spanish called it Mexico City. All right? That's because the Aztec name for themselves is Mexico. So if an Aztec ruler came back and looked at the modern map, he'd say, oh, there we are. In fact, the empire seems to be doing great. It's much bigger than it used to be. All right. Southwestern cultures. If we look north of the Aztecs, we have around 300 BCE something called the Hohokam culture. They began to do some irrigation and some agriculture there. And they had a very subtle canal system with which they irrigated fields. The reason I say it's subtle is we've lived in these areas. I mean, European Americans have lived in these areas for hundreds of years. And they've studied it. And they only figured this out maybe 30 years ago, how they did this stuff. So it's very subtle. They're called the Anasazi, which is another nasty name. It means in either Navajo or Apache, I'm not sure which one it means, old enemies. We don't know what they called themselves. Their religion was things called Kachina spirits, and their holy places were called kivas. The Kachina spirits, it was like a polytheistic religion. So they had various spirits that represented various aspects of nature, like a good harvest, rain, things like that. Okay? Their kivas were round structures, partially built into the earth and partially covered over. they typically had two entrances. The entrance for the regular population, which was through the door, and then there was a secret entrance in the middle of the kiva where there could be a flash of something, and out would pop the Kachina spirit, okay, in the middle of the ceremony. All right. Most famous site is Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon. If you ever go, it's in northwestern New Mexico. Originally, they didn't know what that was, but now they figured out, again, it's very subtle, that they figured out it's the middle of a road network that stretches maybe about 1,000 miles in each direction with other sites and places. This just happened to be like the largest city, all right? After 1200, drought caused the decline, and by 1300, they moved away, and their descendants call themselves the Hopi and the Zuni, and still live in that area in those pueblos, okay? The Great Plains. All right. Originally, this is very poorly settled, okay, because it's missing something. They had the river valleys through the Great Plains were probably where agriculture spread from Mexico up into the southwest, then by river valley across the Great Plains to the wooded areas of the east of the United States, what would be the United States. However, the arrival of the horse changed things. When the Spanish brought the horse, remember, the horse was originally from this area. It was like he was going home, only now he was bigger and stronger, and the whole thing exploded. The horses made hunting buffalo easier, and the success of the buffalo culture sucked many groups into the Great Plains that previously ignored it. So that sort of classic Indian thing, Native American thing we think of as riding down the buffalo, etc. That's modern. That's post-Spanish impact. Okay, eastern woodlands. All right. They had large-scale farming there. This is all the areas pretty much slightly west of the Mississippi all the way to the Atlantic coast. It's all one big woodland. It's all woods. And they had large-scale farming by 2500 BCE. There were early mound building there, 1500 to 700 BCE. The Adena and Hopewell culture followed the early mound builders into 400 CE. And the last one was something called Mississippian, which extended all the way to the arrival of Europeans in 1500. All right. They built the largest site, a place called Cahokia, which was maybe 30,000 people. It's just across the river from St. Louis. What I find interesting is we chose a site, actually I think the Spanish or the French, chose a site of St. Louis as a good place for a city. The Native Americans were at the same site. They were just across the Mississippi River. So obviously, geographically, that's a good site for a big city. All right? It declined after 1300. All right? Now, the most important group up there are the Iroquois. Be glad I don't make you call them the Haudenosaunee. All right? Why? Because they're located in upstate New York. They were a so-called confederation of 5, later 6 nations. In reality, this is a republic. People don't want to say this, but it's a republic. Okay? The women owned the land, and the women voted to decide who represented. The representatives were always men, but the women voted. If they didn't like what the guy did, they pulled him out and put a new guy in. Now, so why is that important? Leadership rotated between groups. There's no king of the Iroquois. There are several important posts, like you might say president, you know, foreign office, whatever, chief of the military, whatever, but there's no king. And they're the most powerful group in what would become the United States. They become the model, our living model, for the fact that you can have a republic and it can be strong.